Well, we got him finished, got him carved. Now we're going to paint him. One of the things I did off camera was go out in my garage and kind of burnish him a little bit. I use a little mandrel. Mandrel is the insert that you can put into a rotary tool. These are 1/8 inch mandrels, and I stack it with 3 1-inch square pieces, maybe 1.5 inch square pieces of Scotch-Brite pad. You can get those at any home improvement store. I think I've seen them everywhere. Anyway, when you put it in there and spin it, what it does is it burnishes it, and it makes it look like you've gotten all the fuzzies out of there. And so some of the places you could sit here and piddle, play, and putter and spend a lot of time getting all these things done. I'm not going to. I do a lot of carving, and one of the things I do is try to find the things that are going to help me do that quicker. Because sometimes get bored, you want to move on to the next thing. So I do that, and it makes it look a whole lot better because it looks like it's been burnished and finished up. It's not sanded, but it's just rearranging the wood back into realigning those fibers of the wood. I like doing it that way. Some people don't, and I don't really care what other people think so much. So I'm going to carve for me, and if I sell a few, then great. If people want some, and that's great. If they don't, that's entirely up to them. But anyway, we're gonna paint this guy now. I've got my water laying here, my clean water and my dirty water. I've got Americana paints, which is primarily the paint that I use. They're very cheap, as in inexpensive, not as in cheap as in not worth it, but they're very inexpensive, and I like using them. They're made by Deco Art, and these Americanas that I use really do the trick for me. I use shading flesh and base flesh on the face, and then we've got red, white, and blue. This is true blue and cherry red, and then we've got cool white. And then we'll finish it off with a little bit of buttermilk. Buttermilk is a good antiquing. I'll show you what that looks like later. I always like to start with the face or the skin or face, and that's what we'll start with. Occasionally during this video, I'll turn on the blow dryer. It'll get noisy. I'll warn you before that so you can turn the sound down. But the blow dryer allows me to warm it up, or not warm it up, allows me to heat it and dry it so I can move on to the next step without having to worry about paint bleeding. This one's about out. I don't have a whole lot left in there, but I need just enough to get it going. Anyway, I use paints that are really, really thin down. When you're doing caricature carving, you don't want it to be very, very stark. I know a lot of people come up to me and they say, well, I don't want to pay that much for it. I can buy that for 20 bucks at, Walmart or whatever. And that may be true, not necessarily the things that I carve anyway. But I want to thin the paint down quite a bit so that people know it's actually wood. Now, I do a certain amount of relief carving where the back is wooden, and so you can still see that. But anyway, that's what we're going to do. We're going to do what we can to make sure everybody knows that it's wood. A lot of times I like to get them wet before I do that, at least slightly wet. Helps the paint flow. So I'm just going to take a paintbrush. I can certainly spray it if I wanted to, but I'm just going to put a paintbrush and get it wet so that I have all of the paint, especially in the face. I want the paint to flow. When I'm trying to paint clear lines, and up here when we do the red and white, we don't want to do that. But when we're painting things like the face, I don't want it to be very stark lines in between the shading colors and the normal color and the colors of the face. So I've got that wet, almost all of it. There's little areas that are a little dry, which is not a big deal. But I got that wet. Now I've got 2 colors of paint here. I've got the base flesh and I've got the shading flesh. In base flesh, I like to mix just a little bit of those 2 together so that the values come close to each other. And you see that they look like they're on the same color palette here. I'll just start painting this in, and it's still wet, and I'm going to paint over everything, meaning I'm not going to worry about the hair, I'm not going to worry about the eyes. I'm going to paint over everything. Let me switch to a slightly larger brush because it might take me all day at that little bitty piddling thing. Anyway, I'm going to paint it all. And this is acrylic paint, so one of the things it does is has a tendency to dry darker on canvas, not necessarily all the time on wood. But you've got to watch that too, so just be careful when you're painting and making sure that you're accomplishing what you want to do. So these being bolo ties, I don't generally carve or paint the back. I leave the back alone and I don't worry too much about it. Because on that back, I've done enough of these that I sign the back up so everybody knows what they're getting. And I'm just going to touch up this a little darker in some spots because I want the nose to be a little redder and I want the lips to be a little redder. And then I'll touch up the ears and a little bit of the cheekbones. Make sure you paint down here in the nostrils, because if you don't and you turn it upside down and look at it, that looks funny if it ain't painted. Before you dry it, make sure you've gone over the entire painting and have painted everything that you want to paint this color. I know I have a lot of tendency sometimes to miss a spot. My wife will say, "You got a holiday right there," and I'll have to go back and fix it. Not my favorite thing to point out to somebody, but anyway, that's one of the things that happens. You're painting, you get in a hurry, and so you forget what you're doing. I'm going to turn on the hair dryer real quick. Just dry this out. So watch your sound. That's dry. All right. The bottom of the hat, the brim of the hat, and certain parts of it are white. So the first thing I want to do is paint the blue. I want to paint that blue stripe right there, and that won't take me that long because it's only a little small stripe. So I don't have much to paint there, just a little bit. I don't need a lot of paint. And I'm going to water this paint down quite a bit. So if you'll notice, we'll put the paint in there, and then I put a lot of water in there because I want it to be watered down. I don't want it to be very, very, very stark and bright, that color. All right, I don't need much blue. I'm just going to paint that part right there. And if you'll notice, it's still a little bit wet in some areas, so it wants to run. I'll paint over that a little bit later when we get to that color. But when you water your carving, just to allow the paint to flow, and then go back later, especially if you're using very wet paint, which I'm doing. There's a lot of water in here to allow it to flow. You have to watch out for that because it has a tendency to flow. Especially the larger brushes you use, the more paint you're picking up, and it has a tendency to want to flow on you quite a bit. So I'm a little bit hesitant to do a lot of that wetting down before I paint. I do on some, but not on all of them. Okay, I've got the blue. Again, I'm going to hit it with the hair dryer real quick. So watch your sound. It won't be but a few seconds. I didn't talk about getting out gray paint, and I'm going to use gray paint for his hair, but anyway, let's get a little bit of red out there. Again, water it down. Mix it well. Keep things on the straight and narrow when I'm painting, especially with these Uncle Sam's. I paint the first stripe red. And I'm using a small brush so that I'm not over painting. You're going to get some in some areas. That's just the way it's going to happen. I'm using a small brush not much smaller than the stripe that I'm going to paint. And again, be careful about how much paint you pick up at any one time. And these bolo ties being small carvings have a tendency to not need a whole lot of paint, and you need small brushes, especially if you're going to do details. Like I say, some of my other fellow bolo tie carvers, theirs are big and bold carvings, and they don't need a whole lot of the smaller details, but I put a lot of details on mine, so I kind of like it that way. So I do the red on the front stripes, and I'm going to do the red on the top stripes. Probably as boring as I'll get out and sit here and watch me paint. There we are with our red and our blue. Next we're going to do white. First thing I'm going to do before I get any white out is I'm going to open up the lid, and I'm going to use that little bit of white in there to do his eyeballs. So I've got a real tiny brush here. This is a 20-aught, which is a 20-0, meaning it's real tiny. You can see how little that tip is. And I just want to cover the white of the eyes. And I just get a little dab on there, and being real careful, because this white has a tendency on these real small carvings to go everywhere. You end up with white in places you don't really want them. But like I said earlier, you can ruin a good carving with bad painting, but you can also rescue a bad carving with good painting too. I've seen it done. Probably done a few of them myself. Ruined a good carving. Anyway, got his eyes white. And we're at 13 minutes, so we'll stop there and finish up that white here in just a little bit. See you on the next video.